Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Barden. I'm here at North Carolina State University with North Carolina State Extension, and I'm bringing you today the webinar on options for managing beaver damage. This is a program sponsored by the North Carolina Tree Farm Program. To get things started, I want to remind you, you can get a copy of today's slides available on the page you joined from the portal. All you got to do is scroll down to the bottom of that page and you will see a link. Also, I'm going to post that link right in the chat real quick for those that are joining. You can click on the link there in the chat and also download a copy of the slides. We are recording today's session and it will be available to watch later on demand. So you can go back and see that. All you got to do is join back in the portal where you joined today and you'll be able to get to the recording. Also, as we get through the presentation today, if you get questions, we're going to ask that you enter those into the Q&A feature of Zoom. All you got to do is click on the little Q&A icon and you'll be able to add your questions in there and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature and not the chat. That way we can keep track of questions so they don't get buried and we miss that opportunity to ask your question. As I indicated, today's webinar is brought to you by the North Carolina Tree Farm Program. And we will make sure this information's up at the end if you'd like to record the email address or the phone number or to visit their website. And with that, I'm going to introduce the director of the Tree Farm Program, Leslie McCormick, and she will introduce our speaker today. Leslie?
Thank you, Bob. Fallon Owens is our presenter today, and she is a wildlife extension biologist for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. Her work focuses on best practices related to human-wildlife interactions, including management and prevention of conflicts with wildlife. For 8 years, Fallon has served as chair of the North Carolina Beaver Damage Control Advisory Board and as administrator of the North Carolina Beaver Management Assistance Program. She co-authored Best Practices for Managing Human Beaver Conflicts in North America, Balancing Ecological Benefits and Human Interests, and she holds a master's degree in wildlife and renewable natural resources from Louisiana State University. It's my pleasure to introduce Fallon to you for today's presentation. Thank you, Fallon.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm really excited to be here. Let me get my presentation up and running for everybody here. And bear with me for just a second to make sure I click on the right thing. And hopefully you can all see the presentation right now. I assume so.
It's up. You're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always good to have that confirmation.
Yeah.
So as Leslie mentioned, I do a lot of work with beavers and I do a lot of work with people to help them understand conflicts with all sorts of wildlife. And today I want to basically tell a whirlwind tour of beavers in North Carolina with some implications more broadly in the United States. I know there might be people attending from places outside of North Carolina. Most of the details that I talk about and resources are specific to North Carolina, but every state has other resources, many of which are similar. So let's get started with some history about beavers here in North Carolina and more specifically in North Carolina. And did I say America? In America. So anyway, going back to the colonial era when Europeans were first settling North America, they discovered that there was a thriving economy that was based on beaver products. So the native tribes used beavers extensively. They were a form of money. The pelts were used for clothing. The fur of beaver is extremely warm and the leather is durable. So those were used for clothing, and also beaver meat was a major source of food for native tribes and for early American colonists. what they did, they were so excited about this amazing sort of wildlife resource that they began exporting beavers from the New World to Europe. And that created a huge economy that was based on beaver products in Europe. One of the most famous being hats, like beaver pelt hats were all the rage for wealthy Europeans. And so a lot of that economy drove people to settle America. So in some ways, we can blame the speed of the colonization of the United States on the value of beavers. Um, so, sort of fast forwarding through that colonial era, because there were no protections for beavers and or for wildlife in general, there were no caps on how many beavers could be removed. Really, it was literally the Wild West in terms of harvesting as much wildlife as you wanted for whatever purpose you wanted. And so vast amounts of beavers were harvested across the United States as trappers pushed further west to get access to that really valuable resource. And many people made their livelihoods and fortunes off of harvesting beavers and exporting them to Europe. Because there were no controls or protections, and beavers were considered to be a completely unlimited resource, basically we had to learn the hard way that they were not, in fact, an unlimited resource. And honestly, by the Civil War era, about the 1860s, beavers had gone from being extremely abundant across the United States to the exact opposite. They were extremely rare. And here in North Carolina specifically, it was 1897, close to the turn of the century, that the very last beaver was harvested in North Carolina. So they were actually harvested to complete extinction within this state. And that was the case for about 40 years. There were literally no beavers anywhere in the entirety of North Carolina. And we learned a lot about the damage that could happen when there's unlimited harvest for wildlife in that time. So I'll quickly go through a little timeline of what happened in the 1900s related to beavers. And so pretty early on, North Carolina itself got its very first wildlife protection law. Basically, it started out with saying you have to have a license to harvest wildlife, and we're going to make seasons when you can and cannot harvest these animals so that they can reproduce and replenish their numbers in between these harvests. Then in 1927, North Carolina actually secured funding for wildlife conservation. And that meant that we were able to hire biologists and wildlife enforcement officers to learn about our wildlife populations and protect them from poaching. Then in 1938, due to popular demand, because so many people wanted their beavers back. Beavers were still valuable, even though they were completely absent. The history and mythos of beavers was still alive and well. And so North Carolina demanded that beavers be reintroduced. And we did that. So in 1938, 29 beavers were released in the North Carolina sandhills. And basically, it was a cross your fingers, wait and see, and hope that they survive situation. Then in 1947, the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, the agency that I work for, was actually officially established, which created more opportunity and resources to be able to reestablish wildlife populations. And then in 1953, the biologists that worked for the Wildlife Commission were able to confirm that there were an estimated 1,000 beavers across 7 counties in North Carolina. So we went from 29 beavers to 1,000 relatively quickly. They were doing pretty well. Then the good news, in the 1980s, basically by all accounts and all measurements, beavers were fully reestablished across all 100 counties in North Carolina. And if you lived through the 80s, you can confirm that this is exactly what the 80s were like. It was indeed a very interesting time, but a very exciting time for beavers because they had been fully reestablished across the entire state. And today, we know through extensive monitoring and keeping track of trapping activities that basically In North Carolina, we have a population of around 1 million beavers. So at this point today, we can honestly say that we have successfully reestablished beavers. We can't say that there are as many beavers as there were back before sort of people started developing the landscape, but we can say that their populations today here in North Carolina are very healthy, and they're very well established. And basically, beavers are abundant here, and not every state can say that. So that's the history lesson. Let's talk a little bit about the natural history of beavers themselves. This should be a little bit fun. Let's talk about their size. Compare them to, say, an average human. We'll use Justin Bieber as an example. By the way, in case you were curious, he's 5'9", and beavers roughly are about the size of knee height on an average person. They are the largest rodent in North America. So, that's very a distinguishing characteristic that they have. And they are the second largest in the entire world, only beaten in size by the greater capybara, which is found in South America. So they're really big animals, and they are rodents. So going through a couple more rodents that we have here in North Carolina that are unusually large. We have nutria, which is an invasive species that was established for fur trapping. They're also aquatic. Then we have groundhogs, which are a little bit smaller, and they're not necessarily aquatic. So you can find groundhogs away from water. And then our smallest large rodent is the muskrat, which is also aquatic, but significantly smaller. They're only about the size of maybe a small rabbit. So a little bit about the features of beavers. One, they have these really orange teeth that's very distinctive. We only have a few rodent species that have those really orange teeth, and they're bright orange. And they kind of have this dark sort of mustache line feature on their face. So their noses are dark and they have a dark mustache, and their whiskers are dark. This is important to know because that helps you distinguish them from some of our other aquatic rodents, which we'll talk about in a second. They also have these really tiny beady eyes compared to the size of their face. So if you wanted to be a pro at identifying beavers, this is all important because if we compare them to some of our other rodents, there's a lot of room for mix-up. And when I was making this presentation, all of these photos online were labeled as beavers. And I just want to give you a second to, on your own, try to guess which ones of these are beavers and which might be some of the other aquatic rodents that we have. Again, all of these were labeled as beavers online, so don't necessarily trust what you see online. And if you've made your guesses, I'll go ahead and give away the fact that only the top middle one is actually a beaver. Again, look at the dark whiskers, dark nose, dark mustache, and orange teeth. Whereas some of the other ones we have are, for example, the ones with white whiskers and a white mustache. They look like they're maybe a really old beaver, but they're actually nutria. So if you see white whiskers, that's going to be nutria, which we have in the eastern part of North Carolina. And then the other one, these two right here are groundhogs. They kind of have a small nose and large eyes compared to the rest of their face. And their ears are kind of the same shade as the rest of their body. Again, groundhogs can be found far away from water. And then the final one right here is a little bit of a trick because if you saw these in person, you would know that this is definitely not a beaver because muskrats are so small compared to beavers. But just in terms of facial features, they have really pointy noses and they look much more like large rats than they look like beavers. So there you go. Now you can be an expert at identifying beavers just from the facial features alone. But also there's a couple of other really distinguishing features. They have these gigantic rear feet that are fully webbed, just like a duck's. And this is what they use to swim. So beavers are aquatic. They're excellent swimmers, and they basically paddle with these giant feet. And they actually have a really neat adaptation on their hind toes. They have a single hind toenail on each hind foot that is modified to have a split in it. And essentially, they use that to comb their fur, to keep their fur in good condition and keep it fluffy and insulated so that they can stay warm in frigid water. Of course, most people are aware that beavers have these really flat paddle-like tails. They don't use these for swimming, although they might use it a little bit as a rudder to steer. They don't actually swim with their tail. They do, however, use it for communication. So if you've ever been by a beaver pond, maybe early in the morning or at night, you might have actually heard a beaver slap its tail against the water as a warning signal that danger is nearby. And I've got a little video to show that right here.
And they're obviously super strong to haul that log there.
There you go. So, beavers will use their tail to communicate with that really stark, loud slap to the other beavers in the area that there's a threat nearby. And if you hear this from a beaver, you are probably the threat that that beaver is communicating to its family.
And they're obviously
Beavers also communicate through scent. So they are territorial animals. This is really important to understand about beavers. A family of beavers will defend their territory from any invading beavers. They do not tolerate members or beavers that are not part of their immediate family. And part of the way that they communicate, this place is mine, is by building castor mounds. So they'll actually use their front paws to push mud and sediment out of the water onto the bank, and they'll make a pile that's roughly beaver sized, and then essentially they will rub their anal glands against the top of that mound, and they have this really interesting scent that their glands will produce that basically communicates to any other beaver that smells that scent that this territory is occupied. They can tell whether a beaver is related to them or not related to them based on the distinct smell. So they have really excellent sense of smell. And this is a way that they basically establish their property boundaries and keep other beavers out. So if you see these mounds and maybe you'll notice an interesting smell coming off of it, that could very well mean that area is occupied by beavers. And the beaver mounds are much smaller and very distinctive from beaver lodges. A lot of people get the lodges mixed up with beaver dams, but beaver lodges are essentially the home that beavers build for themselves. It's a mound that they build with mud and sticks that has an opening in the center that they actually live in. And that's where they will sleep. That's where they give birth and raise their young and groom one another and essentially go about their lives in safety from predators and the elements. And this is what it looks like on the inside of a beaver lodge. You can see there's a chamber that's above the water level. And it's really neat how they do this because they build the entrance underwater so that there's no way to get into that lodge other than actually going underwater. So they're very safe from predators that way. And it's a really neat piece of engineering that they're capable of that's very distinctive from what you may or may not be more familiar with, which is the beaver dam. Now, the beaver dam, of course, is one of the things that beavers are most renowned for and notorious for because it is the dam that they build to stop up and block the flow of water. Now, beavers build these dams in order to create their own habitat, very similar to how human beings create roads and fences and neighborhoods and buildings to create environments that are for our benefit. Beavers are able to create their own habitat, specifically aquatic habitat, by building these dams because they are aquatic and they're most comfortable and safe living in bodies of water. Not only do they use this to block the flow of water, but they also will use the dam to raise the water table so that the level of the water can be closer to trees because the primary food item that beavers eat is trees. So let's talk about that real quick. Um, there's a lot of confusion about the specifics of what makes up a beaver's diet. So let's speak specifically about what they eat. And technically speaking, beavers are what we call lignivores, which is technical speak for the fact that they eat wood. But beavers don't just eat any wood. As a matter of fact, they don't eat dead wood at all. So if you were to take a firewood log and give it to a beaver, it would not be able to eat that at all. It's not digestible to beavers. It doesn't have the nutrients that beavers need to survive. What they do eat is actually a very specific part of living wood called the cambium layer. And the cambium is basically what you see when you scratch a living twig and you see green underneath. That green layer is full of sugars and nutrients and calories, and that specifically is what beavers eat. So again, they can't find that from dead wood. They have to get it from living wood, which is the reason why they have to cut down trees in order to get access to the vast amounts of living cambium up above in the foliage and canopy. So when we look at beaver sign, usually we'll find things like what's in the center picture here. You'll notice that there are a bunch of twigs, and they basically all of the bark and the cambium layer have been stripped off by the beaver's teeth. So they literally, almost like human beings will eat corn off of a corn cob, they strip the cambium layer off of the branches and they'll leave the dead wood behind because, again, they can't eat dead wood. So when you see damage like the picture in the bottom right, the tree that's being cut down, they're not eating the wood here. They're actually intentionally cutting the tree down so that they can get to the living branches above. And because dead wood is not digestible to them, they will even go as far as clipping the branches off of the tree that they have recently felled and dragging those branches into the water. And they'll shove these fresh branches into the muck at the bottom of the beaver pond, essentially to use the pond as a refrigerator. Again, these are amazing animals. They have a name of ecosystem engineers because they are so ingenuitous. They are a genius in how they modify their environment to their own benefit. So they use the pond as a refrigerator to store that fresh foliage and those fresh branches until they're ready to eat. And usually that's how they survive the winters, by storing a bunch of those branches underwater when there's no fresh wood available and it's too cold to go out very much. They will also eat leaves, and sometimes they'll go after corn. So in the two images on the left, there's actually an image of a corn stalk that has been taken down by a beaver, and then you'll see the beaver has dragged those corn stalks into the water to keep them fresh. So there's a good example of a beaver food storage activities. Okay, so I've gotten through the natural history of beavers, and before I really get into the meat of this talk, the reason why most of you are here to talk about kind of the downsides of beavers and what we can do about the damage that they cause, I really want to spend a little bit of time talking about the benefits of beavers, because these animals really are beneficial to the environment and to humans in a lot of ways. And so it's important to have a balanced understanding that these are not all good animals. They are not all bad animals. They're neither pests nor saints. They're somewhere in between. And so understanding how to appreciate beavers goes a long way in understanding how to coexist, and not get us back into a situation like we did historically where we're trying to get rid of them because we reintroduced them very intentionally. We want to have them around, as long as they're not causing too many problems for us. So let's talk about those benefits. Essentially, if you think about a beaver dam and a beaver pond that is created by that dam, it is nature's version of something that we humans create all the time, and that is the retention pond. Anybody who lives in a neighborhood or in an area that has water flow issues we intentionally build retention ponds to hold rainwater and allow it to slow down so that it's not rushing immediately into the stream. And there are a lot of reasons why we do that. One is because slow moving water is filtered as it slowly moves through the soil and slowly moves through plants in the area. So there's water cleaning that happens when beaver ponds slow that flow of water. It actually creates cleaner, healthier waterways. Because the water is flowing more slowly, and a lot of this is about slowing the water down, that helps to prevent erosion. So the stream banks don't get eroded as quickly or at all, which is really important to water health as well. In areas where drought is an issue, which is something that I think we're experiencing more and more over time, especially out in Western states, beaver ponds are really important for holding water so that it's available during drought conditions. Because if the water is quickly shunted away downstream into the ocean, then it's not available inland where the rain actually fell. So holding that water is really important for maintaining and having access to water in drought. And also, as that water sits there, it is slowly draining into the ground, which replenishes our groundwater aquifers, which is extremely important to have access to water for human uses. So in addition to that, this kind of all is wrapped in together with the idea that beaver activity is really beneficial for water health and waterway health. And this seems counterintuitive, but beaver ponds are actually crucially important for reducing flooding. Now, here there's a big difference between localized flooding and flooding at a large scale, like at a watershed level scale. So, of course, the area that becomes a beaver pond, maybe when it was not a pond before, depending on how you were using that property, you're going to consider that to be flooding, right? If it wasn't a pond and suddenly it is a pond, that was not a pond is now flooded. But because these beaver ponds slow water and prevent it from rushing down the water systems, it does actually help, just like retention ponds, slow water and prevent large scale flooding. So, especially along major rivers where downstream there are issues or there are worries about flood risks, all along that water course and especially closer to the headwaters, any opportunity to slow that water down is going to reduce flooding downstream. And beaver ponds are nature's way of accomplishing that. And because I work for the Wildlife Commission and I'm a biologist, I can definitely not go without talking about the extreme benefits that beaver ponds have for wildlife. These beaver ponds are incredibly valuable to a wide array of wildlife species, from valuable game species like deer and waterfowl and game fish to non-game species like songbirds and other water birds, mammals, all sorts of critters really benefit by beaver ponds. So if you happen to be a wildlife lover and you've got property that maybe you can allow to become a beaver pond, that might be the easiest, most efficient way to create excellent wildlife habitat on your property. And because I definitely want to make sure that it's very clear that North Carolina is a specific situation in terms of what we're doing with beavers and where we are with our beaver population. Even though here in North Carolina, we consider our beaver population to be fully restored, I have to mention that that is not the case out west. So in many, many Western states, they are actively working hard to reintroduce beavers. We've already done it here in North Carolina, but in many parts of the West, they do not have beaver populations anywhere near what they used to be. And a lot of the systems out there are water limited. And so the benefits of beavers creating beaver ponds and storing water and helping to alleviate drought is really crucial in some parts of the United States. Here in North Carolina, we don't really have as many issues with drought and limitations in water. So, and we've got plenty of beavers. So when you're hearing about beavers, it's really important to know, what part of the country you're talking about, because the story of beavers here in North Carolina does look a little bit different than the story about beavers out west or even up north. Okay, and now it's time to talk about the downside of beavers, kind of the reason why I think all of you are here. Obviously, beaver populations are beneficial. They are animals that we have intentionally restored, that we want to have around, but that doesn't mean that there is not a cost to having them. And I think most of you are familiar with the fact that when beavers build ponds in places where humans have built infrastructure, that can cause real serious issues, namely in the form of flooding to roads, property, homes, you name it. And for the sake of NC Tree Farm, timber can definitely be affected by flooding. So, thinking about what the world was like back during the colonial era and the heyday of beaver trapping, most of the country and North Carolina itself were not developed. So the world was very natural and beaver ponds were ubiquitous. They were a fundamental part of the landscape. Um, and then we got rid of all the beavers, not intentionally, but the fact remains that there were no beavers for 40 years worth of American development. And in that time, of course, we created habitats that were beneficial for us, from roads to neighborhoods, railway, agricultural crops, and timber crops, and a variety of other forms of infrastructure. Now that we have restored beavers, the world looks a little bit different. And now we have to worry about the competing, the competing desires of beavers and wildlife habitat versus the need of humans. And this is an unignorable sort of a challenge that we deal with in today's world. So here are some examples just from North Carolina of what that damage can look like. We've got, flooded homes and yards, roadway culverts being blocked by beaver dams, which amounts to the roadways being flooded, which obviously is dangerous for humans. Agricultural crops. Here's a farm equipment that has sort of fallen into a newly flooded area, beaver pond. And these are real situations that have been caused by beaver activity in the last few years. And getting even more specific about that, and I think my numbers are a little bit messed up here. I'm sorry about that. But essentially, you can look at this pie chart and see that overall, in 2024, there were over $20 million worth of resources that were threatened by beaver activity. And the big ones in that year were timber plantations and roads and bridges, which are very valuable to us humans, an assortment of other types of resources like water control infrastructure and crops. So again, this is an unignorable problem. We can't just let beavers do what they're doing because they cause real costly damage. So let's talk about what the options are when you're having problems with beaver and fully acknowledge that just because beavers are around isn't bad, but when they are causing damage, we need to have options. Some people immediately go to the option of relocation, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about why that's not really an option, at least here in North Carolina. Again, here in this state, we have reintroduced beavers fully. They are well established. They are abundant here, and they are territorial. So, like I said, you can't just take a beaver and plop it down in a place that looks great for beavers and expect it to be happy there. Because if that area is already occupied by beavers, that beaver that you just released is going to get attacked because they do not tolerate any beaver being in their territory. They also have really good homing instincts. And honestly, most beavers that are relocated don't stay where you put them. They're going to move around, and usually they're going to try to get back to wherever their home was. If they succeed, then you haven't solved your problem. And if they don't succeed, often it's because they've died trying to get back home. So either way, it's not very successful or humane. We also have to worry about the fact that beavers carry some diseases that we do not want to be spreading around. Here in North Carolina, which is one of the top 6 states in the country for rabies, our Department of Health and Human Services does consider beavers to be a rabies vector species. It's fairly rare in beavers here in North Carolina, but it's still a concern. And we do not want to be spreading rabies under any circumstances unintentionally. Beavers can also spread diseases like tularemia and giardia into waterways, which can be a concern for us. And then, of course, there's the liability. If you relocate a beaver to somebody else's property and that beaver then causes damage on their property, that's not great. So, for all of those reasons, and again, this is specific to North Carolina, every state is a little bit different. Here in North Carolina, it is illegal to relocate beavers. It's not humane for the beavers. It can spread diseases. It can cause liability issues, and it's just not humane. It's not a good way of solving that problem. We've got a lot of beavers here. There's really nowhere to put them. So, other options are mostly going to involve either flow devices, which kind of trick the beavers into not continuing to build dams while also allowing the water levels to flow normally. Then exclusion, which is physically keeping the beavers out of areas where they're causing problems. And then responsible, modern regulated trapping is also an option here in North Carolina. And I'm going to go into each of these in a little bit more detail. But first, I do want to spend just a teeny bit of time really asking the question, why do beavers build dams? So we know they build dams because they need that aquatic habitat, right? That's the bigger picture. Why? But what's the mechanism? Why are they driven to build those dams? And I found this online and I thought it was just perfect. So this is a little, I think it was on Instagram, a person asking, do beavers even know what they're doing? Or do they just see water flowing down a river and think, absolutely not? And according to science, the answer is kind of yes. So it's not actually the sight of running water that initiates that instinct for beavers to build dams. It's the sound of running water. And interestingly, there was a really great piece of research done in the 60s by Lars Wilson, where he took a speaker and played the sound of running water and got beavers to start building dams where there was no actual water. They started piling up twigs close to the speaker to kind of get the sound to stop. And if he could stop the sound of running water, beavers didn't build dams. So, understanding that mechanism, that drive of what actually causes beavers to build dams in the first place, is why we can create things like these flow devices that help trick beavers into not building dams where we don't want to build them, or we don't want them to be built. So here's a diagram that kind of shows a little bit about the typical beaver deceiver, which is essentially a pipe that shunts the water and allows it to flow underwater so that the sound of running water in the air is not created. So this can be through through a beaver dam itself to allow the water to flow through the dam, and as long as the water is flowing underwater and isn't making that sound of running water, then beavers are not going to be driven to block up that water flow. And usually these devices are also going to use some form of exclusion or fencing that physically keeps the beavers away from the pipe outlet so that they don't block up the pipe outlet if they do sense any sound of running water. So these devices can be really amazing. They have been very effective in some situations. They're not great for every situation. So it really depends on what you're dealing with, on whether or not one of these devices will be appropriate and effective. I can say that there's a lot of ways to do it wrong. And so getting expert advice or even a professional to install one of these devices can go a long way in being successful. And also, maintenance is a really important factor. These devices can get stopped up from leaves and mud, even if the beavers are gone. They can freeze in cold water, and that can cause the pipes to burst. So they really have to have regular maintenance in order to continue to be effective. And they can break for any number of reasons because, they're outside and the outside is harsh. So if you decide to go the route of installing a flow device to alleviate beaver issues, definitely right off the bat understand that that is going to require maintenance. And if you do not maintain them, they will not work and you'll be disappointed. A little bit more about exclusion. So here's an example of trees right up against the water. You know, ponds with trees right up against them and beavers in the water is pretty much always going to amount to trees getting cut down because that's beaver food right there, right exactly where the beavers want it. So, if you're producing timber and you're worried about an entire sort of area's worth of trees, you're not going to be worried necessarily about individual trees. But if you have specimen trees, maybe in your yard or on your, maybe if you maintain a park and every tree is precious, um, you're going to want to protect the individual trees from beavers actually getting access to the trunk, and that's going to look like this. So individual fences around the trunks are really effective to just keep beavers from being able to chew on the trunks in the first place. Um, Beavers have constantly growing teeth. As rodents, their teeth are always growing and they always have to be chewing on something to keep their teeth worn down. And they have pretty big, robust teeth. So a good beaver fence needs to be made out of good stiff wire. Something made out of cloth or thin wire like chicken wire is not going to be effective because they can chew through that. But really good stiff wire is going to keep beavers out. And the added benefit is that this will also prevent the trees from being damaged by deer or squirrels or rabbits, especially if you're talking about small caliper saplings. So having this in your tool belt to protect individual trees is going to help you with a lot of wildlife issues. All right. Other non-lethal options for beavers. This is definitely not something that I recommend in all situations, but it's worth mentioning that if you happen to have beavers flooding a part of your property that, maybe isn't the most important piece of timber property or piece of your landscaping, and, maybe there's some opportunity to allow that area to flood, there's always the option to, instead of thinking about this new beaver pond as a problem, but to change your perspective and think of it as an opportunity. Because again, these beaver ponds are really important for water system health and they are very important for wildlife. So if it's possible, if it's feasible for you, again, this is not in all situations by far, but if it's possible, if you can think of that as an opportunity for new fishing or waterfowl hunting, or maybe if you're into bird watching, beaver ponds are amazing for songbirds and shorebirds and birds of most kinds. And if you like kayaking, there's all sorts of fun recreational activities that you can do with a beaver pond if you can change your expectation for that piece of land. That is a possibility. Sort of make a lemonade with the lemons that you're given and turn a problem into an opportunity. So those were our non-lethal options. And now I kind of want to talk about the lethal options that are available here in North Carolina. Again, we've got plenty of beavers. They're very abundant, and we do have a robust hunting, or excuse me, trapping season for beavers. So for somebody who is a licensed trapper, our trapping season runs from the beginning of October to the end of February, and beavers and other fur-bearing animals can legally be trapped. So, all the historic uses for beavers, for clothing, for hats, for food, those are still valuable uses of beavers today. And I can say firsthand that beaver meat is very delicious when it is prepared right. If you've never had it, it's somewhere between chicken and pork. And so if you process it well and you get all the glands out and you do a really good job of cleaning the meat, it's very clean. It's a little bit sweet, very mild in flavor, very good. And in this picture here is actually legitimate beaver tacos. They're very good. So if that's something that you're interested in, or you want to support the current modern day economy of beaver products, then responsible harvest is something that's very feasible, lawful, and sustainable here in North Carolina. Oh, and in the top right there is some jewelry made with beaver teeth. All sorts of jewels and weird knickknacks are made out of beaver parts. And the beaver hat industry is still alive and well. As a matter of fact, there's a resurgence in use of beaver felt for hat making because the show Yellowstone, which has gotten very popular, has made the Stetson hat more popular, and a lot of these really high-end hats are made with beaver pelt or beaver fur felt. Okay, so if trapping is something that you are interested in, there's a lot of different ways to go. If you're interested in learning how to trap yourself, the Wildlife Resources Commission has a lot of resources to help you get started trapping. And we have a North Carolina Trappers Association where you can learn from other trappers on how to get into trapping beavers and other fur-bearing animals. If that's not really what you're interested in, but you would like to have somebody come and trap beavers on your property, you can contact a licensed trapper and have them come onto your property and trap the beavers for you. That's available during the trapping season, which again is October through February here in North Carolina. And outside of that season, or if you have problems with beaver and other types of wildlife, you can also contact a licensed wildlife control agent, which is basically like a pest control service. They do work for hire. You have to pay them for their services, but they can help you with any number of different types of wildlife problems. And then specifically here in North Carolina, we have a pretty unique program called the Beaver Management Assistance Program, which is available for landowners that are having beaver problems. So let me talk about each of these in turn. I have QR codes because I think they're a little bit more friendly for people these days while watching on a presentation. So if any of these are interesting to you, you can put your cell phone up against the screen and sort of put your camera on, and you should be able to navigate to the link. So we have tons of resources if you want to learn how to trap. And again, these are specific to North Carolina, but every state usually has some form of these resources. So if you're not in North Carolina, go to your state's wildlife agency and they will have their own resources available. We've got a link for learning how to trap yourself. We also have a list of where to contact a trapper, and you can specify what type of animal you want trapped, and basically you give them permission and they'll go and set traps for you. If you want to hire a wildlife control agent, we actually have a searchable list. If you follow that QR code, you can see what county, you can navigate to the county, you can see what species these individuals work with, and basically call and hire somebody to help you out with any number of wildlife issues, from beavers causing flooding to raccoons in your attic and everything in between. And then specifically about the Beaver Management Assistance Program, this again is a unique program that does not exist in really any other state. And it's been going for over 30 years, and it is a cooperative program run by the state of North Carolina, the federal government, local county governments, and even landowners who work together to pay for beaver assistance. So if you live in any of the blue counties, Those blue counties are participating in this program this year, and if you use that QR code, you can find the contact phone number for that county and essentially give them a phone call, say you've got beaver issues, and they can arrange a site visit where a professional can come out to your property and work with you on teaching you about the problem that's going on, find all the beaver dams, figure out what the best options are for you. And if you are not willing to learn how to remove the dam or the beaver yourself, they will provide that service at a very affordable cost. So this year, the BMAP runs at $25 per site visit, not including a free consult and the initial site visit to figure out what the problem is, and $150 per dam removed, which is incredibly affordable because it is a lot of work to remove those beaver dams. So this is a really unique program that we have in North Carolina. Some of the other resources I mentioned are usually available in other states, but I don't think there are any other states that have something quite like the BMAP program that we have here in North Carolina. So again, if you're in the blue counties, go to that QR code to the BMAP website and learn all about this really unique, useful program. And finally, if you completely forget all the details of this talk, or you lose track of the PowerPoint slides that that are shared on the portal, at the very least, I hope you write down this phone number because, especially if you're in North Carolina, this is an information line staffed by wildlife biologists who can answer any number of questions about wildlife issues, any type of problem you might have or wildlife question. They are specifically there to provide custom advice on what you can do, what your options are, who you can contact to help you resolve wildlife problems. So definitely keep that in your pocket if you don't get anything else out of this talk. And if you give them a call, they can tell you what your options are for beaver management in North Carolina if you forget everything in this talk. So sort of in conclusion, I just want to give you some final takeaways, and that is beavers are very beneficial. We reintroduced them here intentionally, and a lot of states are still trying to do that because they are crucially important for healthy waterways and aquatic wildlife, and they do help reduce large-scale flooding. There are non-lethal ways to control beaver problems, primarily by using exclusion or fencing to keep beavers out of places that they shouldn't be, and really neat flow devices that trick beavers into not building dams where they shouldn't build dams. But here in North Carolina, because we have a fully restored beaver population and they are abundant, lethal removal is a sustainable option here in this state. So that's what I have. And just there's another QR code right here because I wrote an article for Wildlife in North Carolina magazine a few years ago, which honestly is kind of a summary of this talk. And if you wanted to read that article, you could follow that QR code and read it yourself. But without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions that I would love to help answering or help to answer.
All right. Thank you, Fallon, for the presentation. It was a very informative talk. So real quick, questions. First one is from an anonymous attendee. How do you deal with the heat? How do the beavers deal with the heat of the Carolinas with such thick fur? Do they stay in the water longer?
Oh, that's a great question. And honestly, before I answer, I do want to mention that Todd Menke, who is my co-administrator of the Beaver Management Assistance Program, is here as a panelist. So he might pop in to answer any specifically detailed questions about managing beavers or installing traps or flow devices. So I'm glad Todd is here. To that specific question, while beaver fur is definitely very, very insulating, the water is significantly colder than the hot air. So I think they are able to stay cool just by going underwater, especially the deeper underwater they go, the cooler the water is. And that way they can basically stay cool in the heat. Beavers are also A little bit smaller than they are up north, so they can release heat from their bodies easier. And their fur is actually not quite as thick and luxurious as beavers up north. So they are adapted. The beavers that we have here in North Carolina are adapted to the hotter temperatures, literally in the way their bodies are built.
Okay, here's another question. Does the BMAP program include help with installing things like beaver deceivers?
I know that they definitely will in some cases help, and they will provide any number of resources to sort of teach you how to build them yourselves. Um, and it depends on the negotiation between sort of the client and the professional, like what level of help is requested and then what level of help they can provide. But if you need the assistance for actually installing one, I know in some cases they will do that.
Okay, question from Carl Dupolt. Any thoughts on how beaver can help restore arid landscapes?
Certainly letting beavers do their thing. There's been some amazing projects out west where they have reintroduced beavers and basically recorded how the landscape has changed in the presence of beavers versus what it was like when there were no beavers. And it's amazing how lush the landscape becomes and how much the water system, especially right along the stream and the floodplain, has been restored and become much healthier when beavers are allowed to just build dams and build those beaver ponds. So I would say, if you're worried about droughts, if there is the opportunity to allow beavers to build ponds, you know, they do that for free and they're very good at it. The real trick is just managing issues when beavers are building dams in places that cause flooding for us. So if the landscape is big enough and undeveloped and you can allow beavers to just do their thing, that's a really great way of managing water scarcity.
All right, the next question, can beavers climb? And if so, how high? For instance, can they climb a 2-foot high raised planter wall?
I guess it depends on if there's anything against it. They're not like particularly good climbers, not as good as groundhogs. Groundhogs are actually really good climbers. They have some amount of climbing ability, but they're much more likely to stay close to or directly in water than they are to be climbing over tall things. Yeah, they just feel really safe in the water, so that's mostly where you're going to find them.
All right, next question is, can damage from beavers be quantified by a forester and used as a loss on a tree farm operation?
Oh, goodness. I don't off the top of my head know how that would work. But we for the beaver management assistance program, we quantify the amount of damage that the beavers would have caused if we didn't go in there and do something about the beavers. So we do have a system that we use to quantify damage. And that could be used for other purposes as well, potentially.
All right, the next question is, what factors do the beavers management assistant people consider when making a decision whether to relocate a beaver?
So here in North Carolina, we do not relocate beavers. It is against the law to relocate beavers because I mentioned they're territorial and they don't stay where you put them, and we have a lot of them and they can spread diseases. So in some other states, relocation is an option, but that is not a legal option here in North Carolina.
Okay, last question. Can beavers transmit disease from tree to tree?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I'm not an expert on plant pathology. I know that plants can get viruses and bacterial infections and fungal infections just like humans, but I'm not particularly aware of beavers transmitting diseases from plant to plant. And honestly, if a beaver is chewing on a tree, it's probably going to end up killing the tree. So there won't be an opportunity for the tree to get sick from a pathogen. Um, so, maybe beavers just kind of prevent that issue altogether by just eating the tree.
All right, thank you very much. I just want to remind everybody, first of all, I'm going to share my screen. So if you want information on how to reach the North Carolina Tree Farm program, here it is available for you. Also, today's webinar is being recorded, and be able to view it in the future. All you have to do is go back to forestrywebinars.net and you'll find it on the portal. You can click on the North Carolina Tree Farm program link there in the portal, and you can see all of their webinars that they've hosted over the years. Or you can it has a search feature. You could search for the name of the program, or if you save the link for today's webinar, you can just go directly back to that link. The recording should be available early next week for those that would like to go back to it soon. Also remember, our resources that Fallon talked about are available on the portal's website with direct links to many of the things that she talked about today. And with that, thank you everybody for joining today's webinar.